How would I prove the Bible is history, not a myth? Funny you should ask. What if the most debated book in history, the Bible, wasn't a collection of myth, but the most reliable historical document from the ancient world? It's a book people have died for, they've built nations on, and some have dismissed as fiction. The popular narrative suggests it was pieced together centuries after the fact by power hungry councils, a game of historical telephone, if you will, where the original message was lost. But what if the evidence shows the exact opposite? What if the paper trail is so vast and so early that it dwarfs every other document from antiquity? If I had to prove the Bible is history, not myth, well, there is just so much evidence. And this is such a deep dive. I mean, if you like rabbit holes, this is a fun rabbit hole to get lost down for a while. There are these tremendous minds through historians, theologians, archaeologists, anthropologists who've spent time and energy exploring these things and presenting them in lectures, in universities and seminaries. Right now, I've been loving the work being put out by Wes Huff and the Wesley Huff and his group, but Ligonier has a great message about the archaeological evidence for why we believe the Bible, the Bible's accuracy. Talk about the chain of custody and external proofs and all these things. And it's just when I started trying to figure out how to do an episode like this, my mind was blown. I felt so overwhelmed. And I want to encourage you that there is a lot out there, a heck of a lot more than I'm possibly able to consume, let alone uh, present in any reasonable way. And so for the purposes of this show, I just want to talk about some of those really foundational things. There's a couple of questions that are most common about why we believe the Bible is accurate. And to help those of us that are new believers or not anthropologists to understand and know how to not be deceived by others and how to give an account for what we believe, as the Bible says. And we're going to start talking about some of the evidences for the Bible. The first thing is that we'll follow the incredible manuscript trail. It shows how the text was preserved with stunning accuracy. Then we'll dig into the ground and uncover some archaeological proof that confirms its people and places. And finally, we'll pull back the curtain on how the Bible was chosen, that it wasn't some secret conspiracy, but through a logical process of recognition. By the time we're done, the idea that the Bible was created by a crusty old white man trying to control our lives should be the least credible theory that we can come up with. So, let's kick things off with a fact that's hard to ignore. We have more manuscript evidence for the New Testament than for any other 10 pieces of classical literature combined. It's not even close. This is quantifiable physical evidence, and we're just getting started. But first, I'm Rachel, and welcome to Sacred Spills, Section 1, the manuscript tsunami. When a skeptic says the Bible has been changed over time, they're really challenging its transmission. They're picturing a game of telephone where a message gets whispered from one person to the other until it's totally distorted. This is probably the single biggest myth about the Bible. And it's completely falls apart when you look at the manuscript. Let me turn this light on. So let's start with the New Testament. You know, I've read that as of today, we have over 5,800 cataloged Greek manuscripts. But that's just Greek. If you add in the manuscripts from other languages, that number skyrockets to over 24,000. Now, if we get some perspective on that, how does that stack up against other ancient works that we accept as historically accurate without even a second thought? If we take Homer's Iliad, the second most well-attested book of antiquity, there are nearly 2,000 surviving manuscripts of the Iliad. And that's a respectable number. but it's dwarfed by the New Testament, 24,000. But for other authors, the number falls off a cliff. We have 49 manuscripts of Aristotle. For Caesar's Gallic Wars, a foundational text of military history, we have 10. The New Testament has more copies than any other ancient work by an astronomical margin. But quantity is only half the story. The other, arguably more important factor is the time gap between the original and the earliest copy. Most ancient works, the gap is a chasm of silent centuries. For Homer's Iliad, the gap is about 500 years. For Aristotle, it's a staggering 1,400 years. For Caesar, it's about 1,000 years. Anything could have happened between the time Caesar wrote and the 1,000 years to the first verifiable manuscript that we have. Now, if we look at the New Testament, its books were written in the first century, between roughly 50 and 100 AD. Our earliest undisputable fragment is a piece of John's Gospel. Now, before I say this, I want a disclaimer that my pronunciation is rough. So please bear with me as I try to come through some of these words. Some of them I've not really heard spoken, I've only read, so I just don't really know very well. But my pronunciation isn't great. Bear that in mind when I say that this piece of evidence of John's Gospel is called John Ryland's Papyrus, or P52. The experts in ancient handwriting date this fragment to the early 2nd century, some as early as 125 AD. If John's Gospel was written around 90 AD, which many scholars believe to be around the accurate date for John writing his gospel, that would mean we have a physical copy from within a single generation of its original. This is amazing, and it shatters the argument that the Gospels were later inventions. And P52 isn't some lonely outlier. We have extensive manuscripts from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, like Papyrus 66, a large portion of John's Gospel, and Papyrus 46, a collection of Paul's letters. By the mid-300s, we have complete Bibles, the famous Codex Sinaiticus. I pronounced that wrong, so please bear with me. The time gap between the original and the first copies is simply unmatched in the ancient world. But what about all of the errors from copying? This is where the science of textual criticism comes in. It's true with the 24,000 manuscripts, there are variations called textual variants. Skeptics love to point to the thousands of variants as proof that the text is corrupted, but the argument is incredibly misleading. The vast majority are trivial. They're spelling errors, or maybe the switching of the word order, like Jesus Christ instead of Christ Jesus. Scholars estimate that less than 1% of these variations are even meaningful. And of those, not a single one challenges or changes the core doctrine of Christian faith. We're not debating whether Jesus was crucified. We're debating whether a scribe misspelled a name from a genealogy. This incredible consistency allows scholars to reconstruct the original text with about 99.5% accuracy. For comparison, Iliad is about 95% textually pure. Also, the fact that so many copies survived allows us to compare and attempt to keep the most accurate representation humanly possible. Now, for the Old Testament. For centuries, our oldest completed Hebrew manuscript, I'm going to butcher this, the Masoretic text, but the best I can get is Masoretic text. It dates to around 90 AD. There's a 1,000-year gap that was a consistent source of criticism. But late in 1946, a Bedouin shepherd stumbled into a cave in Qumran near the Dead Sea and found ancient clay jars holding scrolls. These became the Dead Sea Scrolls, a library from a Jewish community that lived around 250 BC to 68 AD. And they had copies of every Old Testament book except for Esther, all saved and stored in this area near the Dead Sea. These all predated our previous copies by over 1,000 years. So it pushed the date back 1,000 years from when the oldest text was to the next oldest text. Having the revelation of something 1,000 years older provided it the ultimate test. Had the text been corrupted over that millennium? The answer was a resounding no. When scholars compared the great Isaiah scroll from Qumran to the book of Isaiah from the 1,000 years later, they were over 95% identical. The 5% difference was mostly slips of the pen or spelling variations that didn't change the meaning. It was stunning proof of the fanatical precision of the Jewish scribal tradition and confirmed the Old Testament's stability over a 1,000-year period. So, the manuscript evidence for both testaments is an embarrassment of riches. It shows the book we have today is remarkably faithfully copied from the originals. Section 2. History unearthed and written in stone. Does having accurate copies mean that the events actually happened? This is where the evidence goes from the library to the dig site. Skeptics have often claimed key figures in the gospel were literary inventions. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who oversaw Jesus' trial, was a prime target. For a long time, there was no direct physical evidence of his existence outside of the Bible. That all changed in 1961. Archaeologists in Caesarea Maritima found a limestone block with a carved inscription, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. Suddenly, Pilate wasn't just a character in a story. He was a physical, historical figure confirmed in stone. What about Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest at Jesus' trial? For centuries, he was known only from the New Testament and the historian Josephus. Then in 1990, construction workers in Jerusalem accidentally broke into a 2,000-year-old burial cave. Inside was an ornate bone box inscribed with the name, translation anyway, is Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Scholars widely agree that this was the tomb of the high priest from the Gospels. The evidence doesn't stop with people. Places once dismissed as legendary have been unearthed. The Gospel of John, for example, was once considered a symbolic late-dated work because it describes places in Jerusalem unknown to historians. John 5 mentions the Pool of Bethesda with its 5 covered colonnades. For centuries, there was no trace of it. Then, in the 19th century, archaeologists found it. A pool with 5 porticos, exactly as John described. John 9 mentioned the Pool of Siloam. In 2004, a repair crew stumbled upon stone steps that were soon identified as the monumental Pool of Siloam from the time of Jesus. These finds are huge because they show the gospel writers had intimate first-hand knowledge of Jerusalem before the Romans destroyed it in 70 AD. A forger writing a century later wouldn't have known those specific details. The fact that the New Testament never mentions the single most cataclysmic event in the first century Jerusalem, the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD, is itself a stunning clue. The silence is deafening, and it points to one thing. They were writing before it happened. They wrote as eyewitnesses or recorded eyewitness testimonies at a time when other eyewitnesses were alive and could have easily called them out. Beyond archaeology, non-Christian writers from the era confirm key details. One of Rome's greatest historians, it's around 116 AD, corroborating the core of the story. He writes about Christius, his execution under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, and the mischievous superstition that spread from Judea to Rome. This is a hostile historian confirming the person of Jesus, his execution, and the movement's rapid growth. An even earlier historian, Thalius, writes around 52 AD, trying to explain away the darkness at the crucifixion as a solar eclipse. But in doing so, he inadvertently confirms that the event was known and discussed. The convergence of evidence, manuscripts, archaeology, and outside sources show the Bible is grounded in real history, real geography, and real people. If you have any thoughts or opinions about any of this, please send a comment so we can dialogue about it. I'd love to hear your ideas. Please consider hitting the subscribe button if you like any of the content I'm talking about. Section 3. The making of the canon. Recognition, not invention. Okay, but who decided which books made the cut? This brings us to another popular myth. The idea that a bunch of bishops at the Council of Nicaea just voted on which books to include, probably to consolidate their power. This theory makes for a great thriller novels or maybe a Da Vinci Code-esque fiction, but it's terrible history. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD never discussed, let alone voted on, the biblical canon. They were busy dealing with a heresy about the nature of Christ. The formation of the Bible's canon wasn't a single event. It was a process of recognition, not invention. The church didn't create the authoritative books. It recognized the books that had already proven themselves to be authoritative. So how did they do that? The early church applied a set of common sense principles to recognize an inspired book. First, apostolic origin. Was the book written by an apostle or a close associate of an apostle? This is crucial. It rooted the canon in the first century, in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. 2. Orthodox teaching. Did the book's message align with the core testimony about Christ that had been passed down from the beginning? It had to be consistent with other apostolic teachings and with the Old Testament. Third, universal acceptance. Was the book accepted and used by the church everywhere, from Jerusalem to Rome to Alexandria? If only a small sect used that book, that was a red flag. And fourth, divine quality. Did the book have this self-authenticating, life-changing power? Did it bear the marks of being God-breathed, as Paul put it? Think of your favorite author. If you were to come across the writings of your favorite author that you have never been exposed to before, would you have a sense of the writing? Would you hear his or her voice in it? Many times we say how an author like Hemingway may have influenced an author like McCormick. We sense the essence or a voice that the author is writing in that is reminiscent of the previous writer, who is probably influential in the current writer's life. In a similar way, when somebody was writing authoritatively from God, the voice or essence of God comes through in the literature, regardless of its genre. That may be a little convoluted, and I do plan on talking some more in a future episode about the literature and genre and things like this. So stay tuned for that. Before we turn to those things, let's continue to try and understand and focus on the historical evidence of the actual physical books. So if we think about the so-called lost gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas or maybe the Gospel of Judas, why weren't they included? So they failed some of these tests spectacularly. Most of them were written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, long after the apostles were dead. Why would they have the name of somebody like Thomas? Well, the people who are writing it centuries later were trying to lend credibility to their writing, so they were pulling out a name of somebody that would have been recognized by most Christians as an individual who was an apostle. So Thomas and Judas were both considered people. Peter, there's a Gospel of Peter, even Mary, were all considered people that would have been contemporaries of Jesus. So somebody writing much later, instead of stealing Thomas's thoughts and then putting their name on it, how forgery happens very often today, they actually took their own thoughts and put Thomas's name on it to add credibility and be a forgery of antiquity. Many of these writings contain bizarre ideas, totally at odds with the teachings of Jesus from the four canonical gospels. They were never accepted by the church at large, only by some fringe, usually Gnostic groups. They weren't lost, they were known, read, and rejected as forgeries. And I will encourage you, if you have questions about it, read some of these writings and see what you think about it. Does it sound like anything else from the Bible? Does it make sense? Are the arguments even reminiscent of the way things are written about? And I mean, just read some of the apocryphal Bible books that were rejected by the church for canonization, because a lot of them are just very confusing and don't make a lot of sense at all. So, the process of forming the canon was careful, it was decentralized, and was organic. Early lists show the core of the New Testament was already recognized very early on. Later councils, like those at Hippo and Carthage in the late 300s, didn't decide the canon as much as ratify the consensus that had already been established for generations. I would also like to point out here that most of the thriving early church was from all around the Mediterranean, including northern Africa, at least as far south as Ethiopia. We have this modern idea that a bunch of old white guys try to force their opinions on people and get them to do things that they wanted them to do. Now, of course, it's almost exclusively male. There weren't a lot of women that were educated at that time. And it was a very patriarchal society. I get that. But the idea that there was some type of white, Western, colonialist ideology behind the structuring and forming of the canon of the Bible is absolutely 100% false. There was definite diversity of thoughts and diversity of cultures being represented through the first 100 years of Christianity. And really, actually, until the Arab Caliphate, Christianity was not a Western religion, and not exclusively for sure, and really not predominantly. So anything before 720 AD, Christianity was not Western or white, and it was not expressed that way in the world. I just want to point that out. For those who might have ideas about diversity and inclusion, the Bible does not come from and exclusively the rights of one culture. Our God is bigger than any culture, any tribe, any tongue, any nationality. I'm just going to point that out now for those that may have those types of questions. So, when you look at the evidence, the argument that the Bible is a myth just doesn't hold up. The mountain of early manuscripts crashes the game of telephone theory. Archaeology and external history anchor its story in the real world. And the formation of the canon was a careful process of recognition, not a conspiracy. No other books from the ancient world comes anywhere close to the level of historical validation. A special shout out is due to manuscript experts like Wes Huff, whose work in explaining this evidence is invaluable for anyone seeking the truth about the Bible's origins. His deep dive into the manuscripts and the history of the text makes this complex subject accessible to all of us. I think his work is some of the best productions about the archaeological evidence for the Bible on YouTube right now. So I'm going to link his video about that in the description. But there are a ton of other people who have done great work in this area. So I also want to encourage you to seek these people out. Don't just take somebody else's word for it. Don't just create your opinion before you've actually done some research. Do the work and then have something strong and reliable to be able to stand on. The questions that shift from can we trust the text to what do we do with the message inside is what happens next. So we're going to start talking about that in some upcoming episodes. But if any of this has been valuable to you, please subscribe, join the community. We are dedicated to growing in our understanding of who God is, not through blind faith, but through a faith that is firmly rooted in evidence. I want to encourage you to stick with me as we talk more about the different types of literature and how we are supposed to do our exegesis before we do our hermeneutics. My pronunciation is so bad, but please stick with me. So we want to make sure that we're not being deceived. We want to dig into the scripture with a little more knowledge and wisdom instead of always what I can get out of it in the moment, to engage with the Bible in order to understand the full story of what God is expressing to humanity in the earth. So that's all I got for this week. Until next time, I hope you remain teachable to God's Spirit as we learn and grow in our knowledge of who God is. Thank you.